Thanks so much for having me. But before I start, just a pro tip for anyone who needs it. Don't invite your wife to lunch on Valentine's Day and have it be the Chamber Award or a keynote speaker. She had a different impression of maybe what she was getting into. But the fact that I'm up here invited by the Chamber to talk about cell phone bans is not something that would have been predicted in 2007 when we started. And yet, as you likely know, a bill to ban cell phones in all K through 12 public schools in Wyoming just died on the Senate floor this session and was able to be listed. That bill was listed by WyoFile as one of the top 5 education bills to watch this session, which, if you're watching the education bills, there's an awful lot of exciting bills, so it's pretty impressive that that one made it to the list. And no one would have predicted in 2007 that this was going to become a hot topic. Now, in the 90s, it was the case that almost every school had a ban on electronic devices. And that extended to cell phones, though there weren't a whole lot of cell phones in the early 90s, but it did cover pagers, it covered Walkmans, Game Boys, etc. By 1999, 30% of the population in America had cell phones. By 2002, 60% did. And so it was quickly skyrocketing in importance. 2002, there was also increasing pressure to allow cell phones in public schools based on concerns about safety and possible school shootings. And by 2007, you have 95% of all college students in America have a cell phone. And it's increasingly becoming the normative practice that you should incorporate cell phones into the education experience in the school. Professors are texting, there's links that are looking up, etc. January of 2007, the iPhone was announced, and it went on the market for the first time available in June of 2007. And so when a tiny little upstart college out in Lander, Wyoming, announced that it was going to have its students turn their cell phones in at the beginning of the semester and not give them back until they left, and not get them back until they left to return home at the end of the semester, everyone thought it was a slightly weird, maybe pseudo-Amish approach, and would not have predicted that in 2024 and 2020, and now at the beginning of 2025, 18 states would have bans, either legislatively or encouraged with incentives or strong recommendations from the Department of Education, banning cell phones in all K through 12 schools. And while the bill did die in the Wyoming Senate, the question about a cell phone ban remains very current here in Lander as the school district is actively debating it. So what changed? One of the things that's most striking about the concern for a cell phone ban is this is not a partisan issue. 2 of the states that led the charge on banning cell phones were respectively Florida and California, which do not really agree on most other approaches to state education. And yet there was unanimity on this point. So now people are asking us, hey, what did you see in advance? Now, partly, we can't claim absolute credit because we did this before the smartphone was really a thing. The smartphone, as I said, became first available commercially in any kind of popular way at the end of June of 2007. But when we banned cell phones at the beginning of the college in 2007, we were still on the dumb phone. We were still focused on texting, and flip phones was the focus. But our concern in that regard was already an experience that was coming from the experience that was highlighted from the experience of pagers in the 90s. So in the 90s, there was an increasing amount of, you'd be in a movie theater and there'd be a buzz. And this is before the vibrating cell phones. There'd be a buzz as a pager went off. And at first, people assumed that buzz was going off for police chiefs, emergency responders, but it was also for your plumber. Or if you were a manager at a grocery store, you might have a pager. And they started doing studies, and they noted already that just the presence of the pager significantly reduced the mental presence of the person to his family, to his leisure time when he was off work. All of a sudden, you could be perpetually on call, such that then people started noting they were getting phantom pager buzz, right? They'd start jumping, assuming the pager was buzzing, a phenomenon that extended to when we all had our cell phones, our dumb phones vibrating in our pockets, and there were articles in those early 2000s about, does everyone feel phantom buzz on the phone? You just think that you're on call and you're constantly checking your phone because you're assuming it's vibrating. And so what our concern was in starting an educational institution is we wanted our students to be free of feeling like they were always on call to someone outside of the community. We wanted them to have the leisure to read deeply, to engage wholeheartedly in conversations with their classmates and their professors, and not feel like they owed something to someone outside, that their attention wasn't demanded just because this person's in front of me, but if someone contacts me electronically, that somehow gives them a claim of priority, no matter the earnestness of the conversation that I'm having right here. So it was intended on our end to deepen their focus, allow for deeper study, and allow for a richer community life. It was to allow for us, as the cell phones were really emerging so rapidly, to reflect on the fact that technology has an effect on us even when we don't notice. Phantom phones buzzing in your hips indicates that there's changes in our habits from the regular use of technology. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to use it, but if it happens so quickly, you might not be aware of the changes that have taken over. And so we wanted our students to take a pause and reflect on that. We also wanted to give them a space so that the technology could always remain an instrument that they used as opposed to a force that dictated what they did. And increasingly, when you talk to people about their use of cell phones, they will talk about being enslaved to the phone, being always on call, not being able to get away, standing in line in the grocery store for all of 15 seconds of quiet and feeling the need to check on what's going on your phone. We have sort of inverted the relationship of the user of the instrument and the instrument itself. All right, so that was, again, before the smartphone. That was just with the dumb phone. Within 3 years, the smartphone had taken the world by storm. And there were other issues that have emerged that are really principally driving the conversation now about the presence of technology in education. First and foremost, there's a phrase that was popularized by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, which has really been one of the leading voices in the conversation about the role of cell phones for young people. And he calls the smartphone an experience blocker. An experience blocker. And in the first way, he says the reason it does that is because it effectively imitates real-world experience. It imitates the experience of community. It imitates the experience of games, of entertainment, right? But it imitates it in a way that replaces real-world interactions. The more you use a cell phone, the less likely you are to have a face-to-face conversation. In fact, the less likely you are to use the cell phone to actually call someone. Right? The increasing use of a cell phone means that as much as possible, we reduce our communication to texts on a screen, or maybe the very subtle use of emojis to capture our range of emotions. You're less likely, the more you are on social media, you're less likely on your phone, you're less likely to check local news. Even with great news apps like County 10, when they've done studies, they find that the vast majority of attention when you're on your phone is not to local news, but to national news generated by the algorithms that are presented to you by your social media. You might read one local article for every 10 or more that you're reading about national politics. Which means by the use of the phone and your increasing absorption of the phone, you become just de facto disconnected more and more from the local community that you're in. Youth who you're on their phone, and again, they're on their phone a lot, but the more you're on the phone, the less likely you're to engage in what Jonathan Haidt calls free play. Going out and biking around the neighborhood, playing sandlot baseball, going to the skate park, whatever the case may be. You're increasingly likely to have your social interaction and your assumptions for how you're going to fill your free time be directed to what you do on your phone. You're less likely to engage in real-world social activities, or when you do engage in those real-world social activities, the phone actually takes priority. Whether that's going out to eat, going to the movie theater, or sitting on the playground. Increasingly what we see is that if the phone is present, that's where the attention is drawn. And eventually, people stop going to movies, or kids stop going to movies. They stop going to coffee shops because they can do it on the phone. And, as studies show, the increasing reliance on the phone actually reduces your memories of real-world events. You go to a site, you go to an art museum, you go to a great spectacle of nature, you take it out, you take a selfie of yourself in front of the Grand Canyon or whatever the case may be, you slap it on Instagram, and when they do studies afterwards, there's little recollection of what was actually seen when you went to the art museum or the site in nature. Your memory doesn't engage because you've locked it away, you've filed it away on the photo, and now you can forget it. Whereas when we've had students go, and they take sketch or just look for 30 seconds. We're not talking about a long time. Look for 30 seconds at the piece of art or the natural vista in front of them. Their recall is exponentially greater than the person who snapped the photo with their phone. All right, so not only do we see the phone replacing real-world interactions, we see that the phone is increasingly for young people a poor substitute for those interactions. It has a different set of community dynamics, which is why people can be ridiculously rude to each other online or over social media. If your neighbor is standing next to you and you come out and you see them and there's some conflict or you disagree with the political sign that your neighbor has, and you say, "You're an absolute moron, why don't you die?" There are long-term consequences for the next time you back out of your driveway every day until one of you move. Whereas in social media, there's no high-risk stakes. You can block the person. Those social conventions that help govern social relationships aren't present. And so you can engage in behavior that's low risk in terms of your long-term social standing with the group, and yet produces high volume in terms of emotional intensity. Also, we can see that it's artificial. Studies are increasingly showing, especially for young men, that the obsession with pornography versus actually dating a girl is becoming an epidemic crisis. As many a young girl who would like to be asked out for a date is able to testify. And Haidt notes this, especially for young children, part of the nature of play is to play with consequences. To ride your bike, to skin your knee, to get hit in the face with a basketball. If play is increasingly not rooted in the real world, but rooted in a social world that's artificial and virtual, there's not those real consequences that highlight when there's risks. Haidt gives this example. Puppies learn to interact with other puppies because they'll be nipping at each other, and when it hurts too much, the other puppy bites them back and it quickly corrects. Low-risk way of properly social conditioning. That's how play is supposed to work for young children. But if play is principally confined to online artificial environments, we are back to being able to have high-stakes emotive reactions, insults, blocks, etc., without subtle correctives that can be equivalent to getting nipped by a puppy. The only correctives come with increasingly intense social ostracization or embarrassment. And so we're giving kids, in some ways, a scope of play that has consequences that far exceed what they're able to deal with, and yet setting them free with way less supervision in that scope of play than we would set them free for playing basketball. And the last thing we want to note about this experience blocker is what Ted Gioia, a cultural critic, has called the dopamine culture. And Ted Gioia notes, when he's talking about dopamine culture, he says, in a traditional, slower-paced culture, there's certain leisure activities. Going to the movie theater, watching a film, playing sports, singing, dancing, going to a concert. It says, in the 90s, especially with increasing intensity, we got into what Gioia is going to describe as an entertainment culture, where we're principally concerned with watching sports, maybe watching a movie in our own home, not going to a theater, maybe watching shorter movies, where we're going to be concerned with listening to not entire albums, but maybe a track. And we're going to shorten the length of the tracks. It says, what we've seen with the advent of social media, especially on the smartphone, is a dopamine culture, where the focus is not long-term delayed gratification, but short, quick dopamine hits. So instead of a film, we have a TikTok reel, and we go to the next TikTok reel, we go to the next TikTok reel, we go to the next TikTok reel. Instead of watching sports, we're focused on betting on sports. Instead of listening even to a track, we're going to listen to a quick 30-second soundtrack or a quick clip. Music videos in general are maybe too long, increasingly. And the problem with this dopamine culture, aside from what Gioia's concern was, is what the effect that it has on long-term art. The problem with the dopamine culture is that it's addictive. These quick dopamine hits are satisfied by asking you to watch more dopamine, getting quick hits. And so then when you go to watch a long movie that's trying to tell a sophisticated story, you have actually wired your brain not to receive pleasure from that because you need to go back to a 30-second TikTok reel. And when I talk about wiring the brain, this is especially of concern for young adults, from kindergarten all the way on through 22. Okay. So within this dopamine culture, then you're addicted, so you need to do it more. And then here's the problem. With every addiction, the thing you're addicted to becomes less pleasurable, and so you have to do it more and more and more. And so we should be not at all surprised when current studies highlight that the average Generation Z 17 to 22-year-old young person spends 7 hours recreationally on the screen a day, on average. That's a lot of time. And that time, as we've already noted, is replacing other real-world interactions, and, as we've noted, is a poor substitute for the kind of learning that's supposed to happen for young people in those real-world interactions. All right. And the last thing that is coming up here then, so the first concern about smartphones as an experience blocker, the next point that's being made regularly about smartphones is the question about what their risk is to societal and personal health. And here, there's strong correlations, but the social science is struggling to see whether we can prove causality. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Anxious Generation, is arguing we can prove causality. And it's certainly clear that you can see a skyrocket of mental health disorders beginning in 2010, about the time the smartphone becomes increasingly common in the pockets of young adults. You see a correlation with increasing levels of anxiety and mental health disorder. And that picks up even more after COVID, which actually correlates with even more time spent on these screens. Now, there are certain things that clearly contribute to that. Cyberbullying, as we've noted, the problem with the less filter for communication, the less consequences. There's the problem with proposing increasingly unrealistic models of ideal body type or ideal behavior. But instead of this only being the movie star that you see in the mid-90s, It's now your peer who has this great social media Instagram filter and is giving you that same model. No longer is it the hairbrushed movie star, but it's the airbrushed neighbor that you go to class with, intensifying the anxiety. And it perpetuates bad memories. I was reading an article where they're describing the experience of when you post, for example, the play cast list, and everyone's excited, and you go and you watch the play, you go up there and you're gonna see if you get the lead, and you look at it and you find, oh, I didn't make it, and there's this moment of dejection and sadness, and you sort of sag your shoulders, you walk away. And the article says, what if someone was there filming your moment of dejection and then posted it on social media and invited everyone to come laugh at how dejected you were? And then that gets hit one time and again and again and replayed and shared over and over and over again. Right? High school is miserable enough without the worst memories of it getting blasted onto social media and repeated ad nauseum. And so we should not be surprised, again, they will argue, if with this increased presence of social media in our lives, we're seeing an increased spike in anxiety. Now, admittedly, all of these things are actually related to the internet. They're not necessarily related to the phone, you might argue, which is true. Though, as a child of the 90s, I can say with utter confidence, we had not yet figured out how to manage social media and chat boxes and all of the difficulties of cyber media before we decided to put it in the pocket and give it to everyone and let everyone record every moment of their life and put that on social media again. Haidt also stresses that there are concerns about social illness with the ubiquity of social media. The increased polarization of cultural debates, distortion of reality and the imitative social contagion that runs through things, and, as I've noted, romantic disruption. It's a lot easier to talk to girls or imaginary avatars than it is to ask someone out for a drink. All of these things are having real consequences societally. And Haidt stresses that, again, we're not saying the smartphone is the cause of the problem. Rather, the smartphone is building on some fundamental, already broken things that were in the culture. Haidt highlights two: a breakdown in community and an obsession with safety. Right? That if you ask people from 1980, what did your parents let you do without supervision? Whereas you ask, what would you let your kids do without supervision now? Right? How many of us would send our kids out to ride their bike for hours and roam the neighborhood as long as they were home before the sun had set? And yet that was a normative reality of independent free kid play 40 years ago. Now, that concern for safety, in part, is driven by the increasing presence of the bad stories that are out there, the increasing presence of all the times it goes wrong, and we're more aware of them. But also, the fact that we don't know our neighbors when we let our kids go roam through the neighborhoods. The breakdown in community. What Poltman had already described as the bowling alone. We don't have bowling clubs. Membership in Elks and Rotary and Kiwanis is dipping. We're increasingly isolated independent groups, and so I don't know the neighbors that my kid's going out to play with, and so of course I'm really concerned about that. Now those are bigger cultural questions, and they were big cultural questions that the United States was going to have to wrestle with and navigate how to deal with it. But those are exacerbated by the ubiquity of the smartphone. And so Haidt's point is not, oh, just turning off the smartphone is going to solve our problems. That's not our point at Wyoming Catholic College either. Rather, in turning off the smartphone, it's going back to the fundamental concern we said at the beginning. How do we make sure that we're aware of what effect our tools are having on us? And how do we make sure that we're using our tools as opposed to letting them control us and dictate increasing weaknesses in our societal bonding? And so I'll just say, as we're talking about banning cell phones at schools, which I am entirely in favor. I'm in favor, in fact, of a bell-to-bell ban. Put the phone away for the entirety of the day. So you get this freedom, you get these things. But I think it's also important that we fill that space with things that correct these fundamental concerns. Fill that space with opportunity for our young people to go outside and engage with nature with real consequences. Fill that space with community rituals where we're getting to know each other and the kids in our community. Fill that space with what we might call front porch customs, sitting out, talking as adults, also not being consumed by social media, but talking to the neighbor. Fill that space with immersive experiences in art, in music, in singing. Fill that space with reading, maybe especially reading old books, because social media provides us a lot of the contemporary. It doesn't always give us perspective on the past. And I think if we're talking about taking a pause from smartphones for some period of time, again, doesn't have to be months at a time, as it is at Wyoming Catholic College. Could be hours at a time. Could be families consecrating entire days to be phone-free. There's, in fact, a movement started because of the experience of the students at Wyoming Catholic College that's helping college students across the country be intentional about how they set their plans for their use of the smartphone. Create the boundaries for the use of the phone, and then fill it with meaningful, ritual, communal actions that connect you to reality and real consequences. The fast from a smartphone is an important thing, not just for an educational program, but for the safeguarding and building up of our community. And that's why I'm excited to talk about it here. I think it is important for Lander, for the culture of the small town we have, for our Sunday baseball games between the adults and the high school kids, for our high school sports, for our communal events and our rituals, to make space from the phone to build a community. And we can begin by doing that for our children. And this will, in fact, not create technological numbskulls that are unable to deal with things. In fact, it will make our youth capable of leading the development and cultivation of a technology that serves human flourishing. Most of the leaders of the highest yielding Silicon Valley tech firms send their children to schools where they're fasting from the smartphone to give them the creativity and the space to direct the use of technology. We're doing that at our college here in Lander. I'm excited that we're discussing doing that in our K through 12 schools. And I'm excited that Lander can be forming young people that will be building up to the flourishing of our small town, our state, and the wider country. Thank you.